Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a concept that sounds pretty straightforward at first, but gets surprisingly complex, and that is common knowledge. We all know what it means to know something, but what does it mean for something to be common knowledge? We're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on common knowledge to help guide our exploration today.
It's fascinating how this idea of shared knowledge, something we use all the time without even realizing it, turns into a real philosophical rabbit hole when you try to define it rigorously.
So let's start with the basics. What is common knowledge? Like, I know the date, but is that common knowledge between the two of us right now?
Not necessarily. Common knowledge is more than just everyone knowing a piece of information. It's about everyone knowing that everyone knows it, and knowing that everyone knows that everyone knows it, and so on and so on. This kind of infinite chain of knowing that you know that I know.
Okay, so it's like those reflections you get when you have like a pair of mirrors facing each other, except
Yeah.
instead of images, it's knowledge sort of reflecting back and forth.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. And that infinite regress is what makes common knowledge so philosophically interesting and challenging. It raises all sorts of questions about how we can ever really achieve this level of shared understanding in the real world, with all its messiness.
I think I get it in theory, but can we ground this with like a real-world example?
Yeah.
I'm having a little trouble grasping how this actually plays out in everyday life.
Sure. Let's imagine a waiter spills gravy on a guest's dress. A big white dress. The waiter might blurt out, "Oh, it was my fault. I'm so sorry." Now, both the waiter and the guest already know the waiter made a mistake, right? So why the announcement?
I guess just because he feels embarrassed and wants to apologize. Is there something more to it than that?
Yeah, there's a subtle but important layer here related to common knowledge. By saying, "It was my fault," the waiter isn't just apologizing. He's making it common knowledge that he knows he messed up. He's making sure the guest doesn't think he's trying to deny or downplay the incident.
So it's not just about the information itself, but making sure everyone knows that everyone else knows it.
Precisely. And that shared awareness can really change the dynamics of a situation. Let's look at another example. Imagine a barbecue, right? Group of friends, everyone's having fun, but they've got sauce all over their faces. The cook comes out and says, "Hey, someone's got barbecue sauce on their face." Now, even before the announcement, everyone knew that someone was messy. They could see each other, but it wasn't common knowledge.
Oh, I see. So each person might have thought, well, if everyone else looks fine, maybe it's just me.
Exactly. They knew someone was messy, but it wasn't shared knowledge. The announcement makes it common knowledge, changing everyone's perception. Suddenly, everyone is aware that everyone else is aware of the mess.
I love that example. It really shows how common knowledge is kind of more than just the sum of individual knowledge, right? It creates this whole other layer of understanding that can actually have real consequences for how people act.
And these examples are really just scratching the surface. Common knowledge isn't just this curious philosophical concept. It has implications for all sorts of things, from game theory and economics to social conventions and political discourse.
That's what I love about these deep dives. We start with something seemingly simple and end up exploring all these interconnected ideas. So now that we've got a basic idea of what common knowledge is, how have philosophers tried to define and analyze it in a more, I guess, formal way?
There are a few different accounts, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. One of the most intuitive is what's called the hierarchical account. This view sees common knowledge as a kind of knowledge tower.
A knowledge tower. Okay, help me visualize this. How does it work?
Well, imagine you and I both know some fact. Let's call it A. That's the first level. The second level is that you know that I know A, and I know that you know A. The third level is that you know that I know that you know A, and on and on. Common knowledge, according to this account, requires all of the levels of this tower to exist.
So like those Russian nesting dolls. Each one contains a smaller version of itself. But this knowledge tower, it seems like it could just go on forever. How can we ever actually grasp all those infinite levels of knowing?
And that's a major challenge for this hierarchical account. It really runs into problems when we consider the limitations of human cognition and the complexities of the real world. And that's where the work of philosopher David Lewis becomes really insightful.
Okay, so what's Lewis's take on common knowledge? How does he deal with this whole infinity problem?
Lewis argues that common knowledge requires what he calls a basis. Think of it like a foundation, something solid on which this whole structure of common knowledge can be built. This basis is some publicly observable event or piece of information, something that everyone knows.
So it's not about each of us knowing every single level of he knows that she knows that he knows. It's more about knowing that we all witness the same I guess, starting point. And from there, we can kind of infer the rest.
Exactly. Let's say we're all in a room together, right? And someone makes a public announcement. That announcement itself becomes the basis for common knowledge. Because everyone heard it, everyone knows that everyone heard it, and so on. We don't need to mentally trace out that whole infinite chain of knowing.
That makes a lot of sense. But then, what exactly counts as a public event? And how do we know everyone perceived it in the same way? What if someone was, like, daydreaming or something?
Yeah, those are all good questions, and they point to some of the, I guess, challenges of trying to define common knowledge precisely in the real world. It's not always so neat and tidy. Lewis's account, though, is very insightful, but it doesn't completely get rid of the possibility of ambiguity and misunderstanding.
This is reminding me of that saying, to assume makes an ass out of you and me. So are there other philosophical accounts that, I don't know, try to tackle these real-world complexities of common knowledge a little more directly?
Definitely. Another really important account comes from Robert Even, who connects common knowledge to this idea of what are called partitions. You can think of a partition as a way of dividing up the world, all the possibilities based on what you know at any given time.
Okay, so it's like we each have these different mental models of how things might be,
Yeah,
and those models are built based on the information we have.
precisely. And the more information you have, the more detailed your partitions become. It narrows down the possibilities you're considering. So, for example, let's say you're meeting a friend at a coffee shop, but you only know they like independent coffee shops, not which specific one. In that case, your partition would include all the independent coffee shops in the area, right? Those are all the possibilities you're considering.
Right. And then if they text you and say, hey, I'm at the one with the blue awning, suddenly your partition shrinks.
Hmm.
Now there's just one possibility, the shop with the blue awning.
Exactly. Now, for something to be common knowledge, according to Amen, everyone involved needs to have the same partition. Everyone needs to be considering the same set of possibilities based on the shared information they have.
So even little differences in what people know can lead to miscommunication and problems coordinating, right? Because their partitions might not line up perfectly.
That's a key insight. It highlights how fragile common knowledge can be. Even if we all start with the same basic information, tiny differences in how we interpret things or the way we process that information can lead to our partitions diverging.
This all makes me think about that no disagreement theorem that we talked about earlier. If common knowledge is so tricky to achieve in real life, does this theorem even hold water?
Yeah, the no disagreement theorem basically says that if you have two people who are perfectly rational
Right.
and they have common knowledge of their beliefs and they start with the same background information, well, they can't disagree. It sounds kind of counterintuitive, I know.
Yeah. I mean, people disagree all the time. Just look at social media.
But that's exactly why the theorem is so interesting. It forces us to examine the reasons why disagreements actually happen. And it highlights just how important common knowledge or the lack of it is in those disagreements.
So are you saying that disagreements often happen because people think they're on the same page, but really there's a lack of genuine shared understanding?
Yeah, a lot of times that's exactly it. But you have to remember, this no disagreement theorem, it's based on some pretty big assumptions. First, it assumes everyone's perfectly rational, which is almost never the case in the real world, right? We're influenced by all kinds of things. Emotions, biases, those little irrational quirks that make us human.
And even when people are trying to be rational, we all come to the table with different experiences, different backgrounds, different information.
Right. And that brings us to the second big assumption, that everyone starts off with the same background information. Which, again, isn't always true in the real world. So even if two people are both being super logical, if they're working from different sets of facts or interpretations, well, disagreements are bound to pop up.
It's like trying to do a puzzle, but you each have different pieces. You might both be brilliant puzzle solvers, but if you're not working with the same pieces, you're going to end up with totally different pictures.
That's a great analogy, and it really emphasizes the importance not only of shared information, but of shared understanding for reaching genuine common knowledge.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how common knowledge goes way deeper than just having the same facts rattling around in our heads. It's about understanding how those facts connect to our beliefs, our expectations, and even how we think other people see the world.
And that's where things get really fascinating. Common knowledge isn't just about static facts, it's about this dynamic, evolving understanding that shapes our interactions and the choices we make in really powerful ways.
This is blowing my mind. Okay, so we've talked about Lewis's idea of a basis and Ullmann's partitions. You mentioned earlier that there are other philosophical accounts of common knowledge, right?
Yeah, there are. There's one by Barwise, which gets into this whole world of fixed points and stable states in how information flows. It's pretty technical, but it offers some really valuable insights into how common knowledge emerges from this back and forth exchange of information.
Sounds fascinating. Maybe a little too deep down the rabbit hole for us today, though. Any other accounts we should touch on?
There's also an account by Margaret Gilbert which focuses on the social and perceptual aspects of common knowledge. She argues that it's not just this thing that happens in our heads, with abstract reasoning, but it's about actually being in a shared situation where certain things are just like out in the open.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's like if we're all at a baseball game and the umpire yells strike, we don't need to be like texting each other to confirm that we all heard it and understood it. It's just out there. It's part of the shared experience, something we can all draw on.
Exactly. Gilbert really emphasizes the role of shared context and our perception, what we're experiencing together. It's not just about what we each individually know, but what we're experiencing out in the world together.
This whole conversation is making me rethink like every interaction I've ever had.
Yeah.
So much of what we do and say relies on these unspoken assumptions about what we think we know together. But what happens when those assumptions are wrong?
That's when things can get messy. Misunderstandings, misinterpretations, those awkward, wait, I thought we were on the same page moments. Those are often the result of a lack of common knowledge. Or maybe it's more like a misjudgment about what's really shared knowledge.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely had my fair share of those awkward moments. I'm sure everyone has. But look, if true common knowledge with that whole infinite knowing thing is basically impossible to achieve, then how do we ever manage to function as a society? We need to coordinate with other people all the time.
That's a great question. And it brings us to another really interesting aspect of common knowledge, its role in how social conventions develop. Think about something as basic as driving on the right side of the road. We don't have to stop and check with every other driver to make sure they know the rule, right?
Right? We just kind of follow the convention because we have a pretty strong belief that everyone else will do the same.
Exactly. Conventions are kind of like shortcuts for common knowledge. They give us these predictable patterns of behavior so we can navigate social situations without constantly having to confirm that everyone's on the same page.
But how did those conventions get started in the first place? Does common knowledge have something to do with that too?
Absolutely. Philosophers like David Lewis have argued that common knowledge is crucial for how conventions first emerge and how they stay stable over time.
Okay, we're definitely going to have to do a whole other deep dive on that in the future. But for now, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on about the nature of common knowledge and how it shapes the way we see the world.
It really is a head scratcher, isn't it? If that perfect common knowledge is so hard to come by, how do we manage in a world where we're constantly needing to be on the same page as others? Well, one answer might lie in something called common T-belief, which kind of acknowledges that we don't always have perfect knowledge. Instead of needing absolute certainty that everyone knows something, common P-belief says we often just operate with a high degree of confidence, a probability, a P, that something is shared knowledge.
So it's like we're saying, okay, we can't be 100% sure that everyone knows this, but we're confident enough to act as if they do.
Yeah, exactly. It's a more, I guess, pragmatic way of looking at common knowledge, taking into account the realities of how our minds work and how we communicate. Think about going to a concert, for example. You don't go around checking with every single person there to make sure they know the band is playing right. You see them on stage, you hear the music, and you just assume, with a pretty high degree of confidence, that everyone else is in the same boat.
That makes a lot of sense. Common belief lets us have some wiggle room for uncertainty,
Mm-hmm.
while still letting us coordinate and do things effectively. But I'm also thinking about conventions and how they fit into all this. We talked about driving on the right side of the road earlier. We don't need to constantly check with everyone to make sure they know the rule before we go for a drive.
Right. Conventions are really interesting because they're like these shortcuts to common knowledge. They set up these predictable patterns of behavior so we can navigate social situations without needing to stop and confirm that everyone's on the same page all the time.
So conventions kind of grow out of a shared understanding, like a common belief, that everyone's going to follow a certain rule or behave in a particular way.
Exactly. And that's where even this less strict version of common knowledge, that common pill of belief, still plays a really important role. Imagine two cars coming to an intersection, but there's no rule, no established convention for who goes first.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Right. Without some shared expectation, each driver's just guessing what the other one might do, leading to hesitation, confusion, accidents. But as soon as you have a convention in place, like in the US, we drive on the right, suddenly there's this predictable pattern that everyone can rely on.
It makes you realize how vital conventions are for a society to actually work. They bring that stability and predictability even when we don't have perfect common knowledge.
Precisely. And it highlights something else really cool about common knowledge.
Yeah.
It's central to how social norms and institutions come about. Think about everything from language and etiquette to law and the way our economy works. So much of what we see as normal actually depends on a foundation of shared understanding.
So even if that perfect ideal version of common knowledge is something we can't quite reach, we've still come up with all these incredibly complex and nuanced systems of conventions, norms, and institutions, all because we need to navigate the world and cooperate with each other.
It really is a testament to human ingenuity, to our need to find order and meaning in a complicated world. And it reminds us that even those everyday interactions we take for granted, they're all connected to these fascinating philosophical ideas.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. From spilled gravy to the no disagreement theorem, we've gone deep into the world of common knowledge, looking at how important it is, how complex it can get, and how it shapes how we interact and understand the world around us.
And the journey doesn't stop here. I'd encourage everyone to start looking for those real life examples of common knowledge, or sometimes the lack of it, in your own lives. You might be surprised by just how often the seemingly simple idea is at play in your decisions, your conversations, even those times when things go a bit sideways.
That's a great point. So on that note, dear listener, we'll leave you with a final thought to ponder. Think about a recent time when you thought you were on the same page as someone, but then you realized, oops, you weren't. How did that lack of shared understanding change things? Keep those mental gears turning, and until next time, keep diving deep into the world of ideas.